Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Nierenberg, and I'm president and co-founder of Food Tank. Food Tank is a research and advocacy organization devoted to telling stories of hope and success in the food system. It's my great honor to be moderating this panel today, and while I wish we could all be in person, I'm grateful that South by is continuing its commitment to having events that bridge the food, environment, and arts communities. And I'll look forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully next year. I'd like to start by briefly framing this conversation. The last 15 months have been unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. A pandemic that has literally locked down states and communities, massive unemployment, more demand for food banks and food assistance than ever before, extreme inequality and racism, an attack by domestic terrorists on the nation's capital, health disparities making many folks more vulnerable to COVID-19, and unseasonable weather linked to the climate crisis in places like Austin last month. At the same time, however, we've seen how regional and local food systems and organizations and institutions have stepped up to the plate, feeding folks when there were no other resources available. And companies, investors, and funders who are realizing that to change our food and agriculture systems for the better, they need to not only have more recognition and more investment, but more equality and equity. There's a reckoning that's happening that is long overdue. That's why I'm thrilled we're bringing this panel together today. And I'd like to introduce all of our esteemed panelists very briefly. Joy Chevalier is the founder and CEO of the Cook's Nook, which combines the best of her technology background with her love of the culinary arts and a space for the cooks at the beginning stages of their business. She's also a member of Google and Food Tank's Refresh Working Group, which explores the intersection of food, agriculture, and technology. And she is a member of the Austin Food Policy Council. Thanks to Joy for her being such a longtime friend of Food Tank and her commitment to doing this incredible work. Next, we have Carrie Ruff, a general partner at True Wealth Ventures, which invests in businesses that are improving human or environmental health. She also teaches for the National Science Foundation Innovation Core Program. So great to meet you, Carrie.
Nice to meet you.
I'm so glad you're here. We also have Roman Gonzalez, the founder and CEO of Gardenio, a new kind of garden club empowering the next generation of lifelong food growers by sending them everything they need to grow organic food at home with an app and a community to help them as they grow. Thanks so much for being here, Roman. And last but not least, we have Denise Woodard. Denise is the founder and CEO of Partake, a line of nationally distributed allergy-friendly snacks inspired by her daughter's experience with food allergies. Launched in 2017, Partake's first product, 10 flavor varieties of delicious, nutritious, allergy-friendly cookies can now be found in more than 6,000 retailers. And she's the first Black woman to raise more than $1 million publicly for a CPG food startup. So thank you all for being here. This is going to be an incredible conversation. I want to start with Joy and Denise. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, inequities have been exposed in the food system with BIPOC-owned businesses hit particularly hard, as you both know. And I'm wondering if we can talk about how we can create a more equitable food system as the country starts to rebuild, especially when it comes to different kinds of business models. I'm hoping that as we come out of the pandemic, that we don't go back to the way things were.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we can go back to the way things were. I think, well, number one, I just don't think it's possible. I think the pandemic, and then of course for us here with the storms, just my hope, and I was in a call that happened to have our mayor on it last week, and said, we hope the things that we have said in the Food Policy Board and other places have demonstrated the urgency of the situation that we've described, that folks have been describing for a long time, generally about food access broadly to our region, and then specifically what it looks like, the inequity that happens in particular communities within Central Texas. And then from a business standpoint, whether you're talking about entrepreneurs or whether you're talking about restaurants, I think we've all agreed within our own sector that we know that the model is going to look different. I was with restaurateurs over the last couple of weeks, and each of them are all talking about how fundamentally they have to think about the relationship between, here is my product, but here is my product within the dining room setting,
Right.
and which is now the premium product, you know, which is the one that you pay the slight extra for to get
Sure.
that service, right? Pre-pandemic, I should say pre-storm, it would have been, you know, the in dining room with the default, right? It was it was the one that was you got, but it was the one that cost the most, and they didn't recognize it. Now they realize that all their other options and offerings might be, this is how you engage with our brand, this is how you engage with our experience. You do it through takeout, you do it through all of our other channels. They are the easy, accessible, likely softer on the spreadsheet. But if you really want to engage with our brand, you want the 7, 8 touches, you want to be in the space. That's the premium experience now.
Sure.
And
Sure.
that means they're going to have the premium cost for it, that the dining room is the special place now. And that's a total flip,
It is.
right?
Yeah.
That's a complete flip for them. And I think in the same way, you know, entrepreneurs who are in our CPG and other kinds of food spaces are going to end up making a flip as well. You know, what does that look like for a CPG product at this point? Where are the places and the channels that you engage with the product, and really looking at the spreadsheets and sort of saying, these are the channels that are easier to access, and I have to value those. And, you know, where are the ones that really, really cost me, and actually being able to make a distinction. I think sometimes when we start, you know, it's all about just getting out there regardless. You know, when you have a conversation, sometimes the Cook's Nook with an entrepreneur, they're all keen to be B2C. And you have to tell them all the time, you do realize that that's high dollar, high touch. And are you really prepared and planned to do that? And they don't sort of get necessarily what that really means, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, and so now that conversation might look a little bit different. What are your other options, and what are those other options now cost you? So I think there are a lot of questions asked. I think a lot of people will look at those spreadsheets a lot differently these days, and or get them if they didn't have them before, right?
Sure.
Which is always an issue. So anyway.
Sure. Thanks, Joy. Denise.
We've thought about diversity and equality and equity in a couple of ways. So when the pandemic really started to close parts of our country, we were in a pretty critical time for our business. We were going from 350 stores at the start of the year to about 3,500.
Wow.
And so we saw a need to shift quickly to digital to be able to support our marketing. And then George Floyd got murdered. And then there was this new desire to amplify BIPOC owned brands in a way that I had never seen before, that really served our business. And I personally wrestled with a lot of guilt around that, because our business was in a decent spot. And so why did it take this person losing their life and all this overdue conversation? And why were we benefiting from it? And so we really looked to double down on our social mission efforts. And so for us, that was working with the Food Equality Initiative. They're a group based out of Kansas City, started by Emily Brown, a Black woman whose family was experiencing food insecurity and also has the double whammy of having food allergies, and like products that are catering to a food allergic community often cost more than their normal counterparts. And so how could you serve those communities? And so for us, it was starting to give back a portion of our proceeds from our website to be able to feed thousands of families. It was joining their 7% pledge. And so continuing for multi-year commitment to be able to support their organization through monetary commitment and product commitment, and seeing lots of competitors in the food allergy space come together and say, this is something that's bigger than all of us. It's something that's important to do and work on. So we tackled that side of things from a food insecurity perspective, but then also, how do we change the food system? How do we take a little baby step to increase diversity in the CPG space? And so for us, that was creating the Black Futures in Food and Beverage Fellowship. So we partnered with 5 historically Black colleges and universities in the fall of 2020 to have 8 fellows go through a curriculum of kind of the nuts and bolts of CPG, and culminate with a virtual career day that was thankfully attended by companies like Chobani and Beyond Meat and Once Upon a Farm to help the students secure internships and to secure entry-level positions. And we'll double down on that program this year, quadrupling the number of universities that we partner with, tripling the number of students that we're able to support. Because I think one of the reasons our food system is the way it is because the same people have been making decisions about what we eat, who gets to eat, who has access to what. And food is something that you would think would be diverse considering we all eat, yet it's the same people making the decisions. And so if we can hopefully do a small part in increasing diversity in this space, hopefully that will change the power structure of who's making the decisions and continue to support diversity in this space.
And that's
You
just,
mentioned something.
I was just gonna say that's just it. You saw so many people go back and pull out the original intents and underpinnings and the whys of their businesses. And going back to those, and those are the ones who seem to have really pulled through. And it came back to what drove them. Was it something personal, that something happened to them, something physical? We had several folks who also had allergies that drove that initial product, something in their community, something in their family, or whatever it was. Folks who made it through the first parts of the pandemic and pivoted and then continued on even through the storms here. It went back to some original mission, vision, or thing that was tied to them that they doubled or tripled down on and went back to those channels.
Absolutely. I mean, Denise, your business is so important to you because of your daughter. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about her and why she inspired you to start this.
Sure. Well, today's actually her 6th birthday, so it's all about celebrating her around our house today. But right after her 1st birthday, we learned that she has several food allergies. She's allergic to most tree nuts, eggs, bananas, and corn.
Wow.
Our sitter, Martha, who's thankfully still with our family and has some equity in Partake, was like, your daughter has the most boring diet ever. Why don't you ever give her anything fun? And I started to share my woes of shopping the allergy-friendly aisle. And it was, I'm not vegan or gluten-free. And I'd always equated those words with healthy. And then very quickly realized as I started to turn over some packaged foods in that aisle that they're often worse than their normal counterparts. They're full of more gums and starches and sugar and weird stuff in an attempt to taste normal. So they weren't fitting the bill for us nutritionally. And then the products that I could find that I felt good about nutritionally, I think that, kids are often the most honest critics. My daughter would literally just refuse to eat them. And then most of all, I started to think about the emotional impact that having food allergies would have on her. It's every single social event for kids and adults seems to include food. And when you can't participate confidently, it really weighs on your self-esteem, your relationship with food, creates anxiety around food. And I think food is something that should bring us together. And while I was thankful for the brands in the space for providing a safe solution, they weren't particularly cool. They were brands that people with food allergies ate and no one else ate. And I envisioned my daughter growing up and feeling insecure about her food allergies and then pulling out this thing that none of her friends were eating. And I complained all of this to Martha, and her response was, you should start a food company. And that's where the idea came from. That was in the summer of 2016. I spent the next year moonlighting while I was working at Coca-Cola and their Venturing and Emerging Brands group. And then we launched as a self-funded, self-distributed brand in the summer of 2018. And thankfully have gone on to grow pretty significantly since then. But it was really just baby steps. It was going from selling cookies out of my car for nearly a year to going into a regional grocer for a year, and then raising our first round of outside venture capital and scaling the business a bit more from there. And then 2020 was really kind of our big year for growth. And I'm proud to share that you can find our products in about 6,000 stores now. We're growing pretty significantly, starting to expand products outside of cookies. But really the mission is still the same. It's to create products that taste good, that are made with ingredients you can understand, that nearly everyone can enjoy safely. And the name Partake came from me wanting my daughter with food allergies to be able to join in. But what I found as a person of color, as a woman, as a first-time founder, is there's a heck of a lot of more people who need a seat at the table and a chance to partake. And so our brand really just stands for inclusivity and lifting it as we climb.
I love that. I love that. That's great. Roman, I mean, your business is also very personal to you. Gardenio has made a commitment to sourcing recipes directly from the culture behind the cuisine. And I'm wondering what that means for you and how you do that.
Yeah, so for that particular project, that's within our mobile app and is being released actually this week, that particular feature. But as we were looking to sort of say like, okay, if somebody's growing something, a lot of times people will get varieties that they don't know exactly what to do with it. Or they just, they haven't cooked a lot with fresh herbs in their life. And so we wanted to kind of be the end-to-end space for them to be able to figure out what to do with it. So as we started to put together, these recipes matched to what you're growing within the app, there was this question of everything has a political and social lens, and so we were kind of made a bit more aware of that through internal conversation. We said, how are we going to approach this? And we can go in and we can say a holy basil and ground chicken stir fry, or we can call it pad per cow, which is what it is. And we can respect where it came from. We can try and in that process help educate people a little bit on where it came from. We even debated, should we use like the Thai characters versus, just kind of English characters. And so throughout that entire process, we made an active effort, not only to source from BIPOC populations where it made sense and was appropriate, right? Doesn't make sense to give you my mom's tikka masala recipe. We're Latinx, she has no idea what to do. But where we could, we did. And where we could use the proper names, we did. And it's also this effort to actively engage, right? Give people enough to make them feel comfortable and safe. Hey, here's a caprese recipe, and it's how you use basil. We get it. We have to have it in there. But then also going into a gremolata or a chimichurri, people haven't had that, right? Like, so giving enough for people to feel comfortable, but also really asking our audiences constantly to extend themselves and be a little curious. And we think that that's just more enriching. And so that matches our some of our core values, not just of curiosity and the adventure of the world of plants, but also very much our effort to make sure that as we're moving along, even small decisions, things that seem insignificant, like we could have just as well just scraped allrecipes.com, but we didn't do that, right? We did that because we wanted to make sure that at every step of the way, we were making intentional decisions that matched our values and that, invoked the conversation that we really wanted people to have.
And I think that goes back to the points that were made before about the companies that have weathered the storm, whether it's the pandemic or the storms you all actually had, are those with this intentional mission, the ones that have created this personal connection with their consumers as well. And I think that's very important. That seems like what you're doing so well, Roman, is you're really making that connection.
Thank you very much for saying so.
So, Kerry, you're coming at this from a very different space. I'm sure folks are like, which one of these folks is not like the others? And you're definitely fitting that space. And what all of these, what Joy and Denise and Roman are doing, what they need to do to not just survive as companies and as organizations, but to thrive is they need investment in capital. And what I've heard from many folks, and the great Karen Washington, who is from Rise and Root Farm in the Bronx, has told me, she's like, well-meaning white folks will go into communities and, try to tell Black folks what to do. And she's like, we already know what to do. What we need is capital. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how sort of the investment world is changing, not just over the last 15 months, but sort of moving forward, how you see this space changing to invest in people like Joy and Denise and Roman.
Yeah. I mean, so I can't speak obviously for the whole investment community, and I think sometimes that's like the expectation. We live in a very discrete world of venture capital, and I think the expectation is I need money, therefore I need venture capital, and I actually think it's often the wrong source of capital. So I think the first thing is for companies to really assess what their goals are, what their needs are, and who the right matches are for that. And it doesn't just mean, hey, this fund invests in things like me. It's like, do I even want venture capital? Because most of the time you probably don't. And so I want to like put that on the table. So I'll represent venture capital and we'll talk about that. But our expectations as a venture fund well, in general, are a really, really huge return, which means probably raising a lot of money and setting yourself up for this high growth. And, and like you start losing control of the company with other people on the board and their direction and where you want to go and how big it has to be. And for a lot of people that are building personally relevant companies, like if it's your daughter's allergies that are driving this and you're mission driven, that can actually create a lot of misalignment. Or they might be all excited about your alignment early on, like, oh, cool, now we have a diverse company, or oh, we've got something we can talk about as being healthy, or this, has a public benefit. And then as they start to look at the numbers, they're like, that was cute and all, but like, I need to make money. And you don't want to sacrifice that mission. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can often be that way. And I think that's like an important warning. We happen to be an impact fund. Like a certified impact fund, i.e. for us, the companies that we invest in not only have to have diverse leadership in terms of gender, that's the underlying thesis of our company, is to invest in women-led companies, but we actually need to see an improvement in human health or an improvement in environmental health with the companies in which we invest. So hopefully we're more aligned with at least some of the missions of our founders, because we literally look for clinical health outcomes or the equivalent kind of scientific outcomes that there's going to be an actual impact on the environment. So from a food point of view, we're looking for more sort of sustainably sourced food, or food that's really more like food as medicine. It's actually moving the needle from either population health perspective or literally for particular kinds of patients in that case, a healthier food that actually improves, we all, those of us on this call and in this audience probably know that food is medicine, right? It hasn't been traditionally accepted actually in the med school pathway in traditional medicine. I think it's starting to get more attention now, but we are looking at food as actually the way you heal yourself or you keep yourself, from needing to, seek out medicine. And so from that point of view, making sure that you're aligned with your investors around something. So I worry a little bit that there will be some faddish attention to some of these issues because they're top of mind in the media, and investors will want, much like when the Me Too movement happened in VC, all of a sudden, all the women staff members of VC funds ended up on the front page of the staff, the websites of the VC funds in order to show, oh, we have women too, I worry that there will be investment and not alignment. So I do think that there's a lot more attention now to the knowledge that there are actually lots of different communities within our country that aren't getting treated equitably. And so I'm seeing it a lot actually in mental health solutions that are really trying to say, hey, the people of color need therapists and help with culturally relevant counselors who understand them and where they came from, what they care about. Or the LGBTQ community needs a different set of care because of the environment that they sit in. And those same things are bubbling up in food, right? So if I've had a Hispanic diet my whole life and my parents taught me these traditions that are really important to the community we talked about, that food is part of what brings us together, great. But if some of those recipes need to be adapted to a healthier perspective, how do we actually keep the culture but add in the health? And actually maybe expand access to those things to people who haven't had the opportunity, as Roman mentions, to try those different things before. Sure. So I think there's awareness around it. I do think there needs to be better alignment around, what the goals of those companies are with the investors.
Absolutely.
One of the things that sort of happened for us, and directly along those lines, was, the Cooks Nook has, our entrepreneurial section, our corporate section, but then our food services group, which has become a huge section. And it's because, we ended up being the only sort of local food services company to sort of develop here in the last 2 years in the Austin area. And we do about 3,000 meals a day that are going out across Travis County and to our school districts. And part of that was, how do we ensure food services that actually did exactly what Kerry was saying, which is, they are culturally themed, culturally relevant, seasonal, but we also know the health outcomes because we know the populations that we're actually serving, that in Travis County, where we have 25% of our children are food insecure. And of that, 60 to 70% of them are BIPOC in our district and across our county. So we know who we're feeding, right, in that. And so there becomes a responsibility that menu, that food services company does that. It has to. Sure. And being the only one, we had an obligation to do that. And so that's been the core underpinning of the food services group, to have the win-win across the board and to be able to do that affordably, where you can have a mechanism afford to do that. And that's been the challenge. Hopefully we've been able to do that successfully. But again, I think it still comes back to how do we go and live those missions and that value set, to go back to that community that we're serving, using the skills that we have to bring that to the table in a way that makes sense to be able to do that. That's the survivability, sustainability, and I think that goes long past COVID or even the storms, right? And have that business be persistent.
Sure. Carrie, I want to go back to something you said about, this, it's kind of being fashionable or in vogue right now to support BIPOC communities. And, again, my fear is post-pandemic, we go back, we go back to 2019, in terms of how we think about investment, how we think about, communities. How do we get out of that, sort of, bubble that investors were in pre-pandemic and pre, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of the other folks who were murdered?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that needs to happen is VC funds and other investors. So we talk about angel and credit and all kinds of other different kinds of investors need to put processes in place to actually be connecting with entrepreneurs early in these different sectors. And whether that's, through, pre-accelerators, like here in Austin, we have Div Inc. that's particularly focused on, women and people of color. We've got other food focused kinds of accelerators that are helping with the early stages and actually having those early conversations and understanding the business problems those entrepreneurs are solving, facilitating and helping them along. So we do early office hours with companies that are too early for us to make introductions or to give advice or to facilitate connections that they need in order to kind of boost them up. And you know what? It takes time that isn't directly correlated to what we do in our real job. And some days that's frustrating because you're like, I have to get my to-do list done. And these things don't fit exactly, but they're part, I think, of the importance of the ecosystem is to build that platform. And I think especially for those of us who are trying to help facilitate, there's a business opportunity here that I think gets lost. It's like, I'm not doing this only as a favor because I care about women, or because I care about there's a business opportunity because at the end of the day, the consumers who are choosing, 85% of the people making consumer purchase decisions are women, right? And a huge percentage of them in this country are from different ethnic groups. And guess what? They've got the power. Larger CPG companies and other, health related companies, et cetera, are starting to see that millennials and women are choosing healthier and cleaner and greener types of things. And they don't have the credibility with their history and their past brands to actually often bring those things to market. So who gets to acquire these businesses, these big CPG companies? And they have to start to value, healthier solutions that address different kinds of cultures. And that actually, seeing that this is a financial opportunity, while it's maybe a bummer that has to be the needle that moves it, actually money can talk for a lot of people who maybe don't get why it matters to have culturally relevant food or to be different kinds of populations. But if you can show them the financial return, that can actually move the needle. And there's huge financial opportunity here, whether it's sustainable or health food or food for specific cultures, or even just being able to show that you've actually lifted up in economic status the entrepreneurs from these different cultural groups and created a platform for them to have successful lives and feed their families. I mean, when you reinvest in when women come in to increase wealth, they reinvest twice of that than men into their communities and their families' food, education, health, etc. And so it becomes actually very impactful and self-empowering. We just need to get that first step up. And I think that means everybody being proactive about facilitating that.
Absolutely.
I did have a suggestion, if you don't mind. So we're talking about founders of color getting funding from VCs, and Kerry spoke a little bit to the fact that, one, it's is VC right for you, and two, at the particular stages that different VCs work, right? And so a lot of the times, the conversation, even if I started a new business today and it's like, hey, I want to make an oat bar or something like that, I need VC money. Right. And so I think there is some misunderstanding oftentimes of stages. I'm really bullish on the notion that, a lot of founders here in town, whether it's CPG or I also happen to be, in D2C, direct to consumer and tech, that they're often kind of quick to rush to sort of VC solutions. But that often what happens is at that stage, they're often much more numbers driven, and correct me at any point, Kerry, but they're often much more numbers driven, and to a point to where they want you to have a certain amount of traction, right? And so, well, how do you get to that point in traction as a company? Well, typically you need funding to do many of those things, right? Whether it's to hire people, whether it's to buy inventory, whether it's, for all the things that you need money for, anything. And so what often happens is that we neglect that kind of a pre-seed stage of funding, assuming that a lot of these VC funds are working at what they're calling seed stage or Series A. There's that first 50K, there's that first 150K, 500, 750, right? And in tech, it's become and again, I have the advantage of being in both of these fields, that you see all this conversation about like, oh, fund BIPOC founders, right? Fund BIPOC founders, but they have to have like these traction rates, right? Which makes sense, because as a VC, your job is to go and make money on behalf of other people, right? They are not social justice warriors by definition. That is the system that we live in, right? And so prior to that, though, where are they getting those funding? Now, typically that comes from angels, or who are angels? Angels are independently wealthy people. Oftentimes, there will be a strong connection, a personal connection between an angel and somebody asking for funding. Not always, it happens differently. But most of the direct consumer founders that I've talked to, that from major brands that we all know, the difference between the founders I know who are struggling right now and those founders, or that those founders ended up getting a 350K check from a friend who ran a fund, or they got a 500K check from a friend of a Harvard roommate. And so it really, when we talk about why isn't VC funding more, I don't think I think there are plenty of people in that pipeline, but I want to have a conversation, maybe at some point, maybe not even here, about that funding before that, and the conversation around where that initial funding comes from. Typically it's friends and family, right? But we know that many populations don't have access to that kind of funding. And so I oftentimes, when I think about, oh, why aren't people writing checks? Why aren't more founders successful and things like that? It's because it's in this world prior to VC, where it's much more disorganized. There is money floating about, but oftentimes it's highly relationship driven for communities who don't often have those relationships.
So Ron,
That's a great point.
that's a great point. It's a great question. I was about to go there. So, and I'm just, before I ask you the second question, let me ask you a first part to that. So the flip route is the same token is we often don't have that generational wealth to have had assets to go to the bank, right? Which is what I basically did, went to private funding, private lending, having been in tech 20 years, and said, great, I'm now going to buy that property. You can give me $600,000. And they did, right? And you go from there. And most don't have that leverage, right? So if you don't have that network and you don't have that leverage, what are you going to do, right? And then you don't know angels. So how do we teach our friends and others? How do we teach them that thing to gain that first set of dollars? How do people learn that? And how do we teach that? And how do we point them to that?
Some additional add-ons there are that then the conversation is like, oh, you just pound the pavement, right? Go talk to 200 people, have 200 coffees, and then you go do that. But there are other things going on there, right? Then all of a sudden you're person to person, which is now that that's a ripe territory for biases to come through implicitly. In addition, there's
we've had plenty of conversations around a language, conversation, right?
Well, that's the thing too. There's a kind of cultural competence, and there's actually, and I never hear people talk about this, but there's a kind of there can be a shift in values, right? If you're somebody who's very wealthy and like flies on private planes, no offense to anybody who does that on this call, then there can be a way that you can disconnect with somebody who's really just like striving paycheck to paycheck, and even a political difference in that the political environment of a given space, of a given city, and can be different from people who are doing well with that system and people who are not. So oftentimes you have that mismatch and you don't make that personal connection. Correct. So there's just all these additional factors on top of that.
Yeah, the conversation I had, I gave a talk on this right before COVID, actually, at UT, on that language. I called it language, but I think you're right about there's a cultural competence, a cultural barrier here of having worked 20 years in technology and being able to stand in front of a whole bunch of folks and ask for money. I did it. That was my job, right? If you've been corporate, right? You know how to put that deck together. You know how to do that and say, I need $2 million to go and do X, Y, and Z. And I think nothing of it. It means absolutely nothing. There is nothing in here that keeps me from doing that. When overwhelming for 99.99% of folks, BIPOC folks, that is not their life or experience or knowledge or engagement. That is just not, that's not there. And then just to say, to walk out the door and go ask those 200 people, and maybe one of those angels will give you 100 grand to go do X, Y, and Z, that is extremely dismissive. So then we're going to come back to our question is then how do we teach that? And now that's something we have conversations about at the Cook's Nook, right? That's exactly the conversations we're having. How do I prepare you to go have that
Right.
conversation?
Unfortunately, I think the burden does fall on the entrepreneurs to actually overcome the issues of the investors. I wish we could call on other investors to be more thoughtful about how they approach these conversations, to actually, take, bias training in order to be, or to put processes in place that are specifically non-biased. So I think we should do that. And I think but to wait for that to happen is probably going to take too long, unfortunately, for the entrepreneurs. So I think it requires these kinds of programs where we get out and we actually teach these skills. So a couple examples, there's been data now that shows that when women present in front of investors, and this may be actually old news to the people in the audience, so I won't dwell on it, but that they're getting asked different questions, right? So women are getting asked these things that are called prevention-oriented questions, i.e., how are you going to mitigate this risk, and what challenges are you going to face, and what are all the problems that are going to face you? And the men get asked these questions about how big can it be? What other markets could you go into? And women ask the same questions. So it's not just, it's like, it's the entrepreneur who changes what that questions are, but then training the entrepreneur to recognize that question and to know how to turn the answer around, and not, maybe not ignore the answer, but to turn the answer around and then tell the big up and to the right story about where it's going to go is a skill set, right? And I think that can be taught. You can't maybe fix the bias of the person sitting in the audience, but you can learn how to overcome that bias on your end. Similarly, like with asking for money, I always try to remember, really encourage entrepreneurs to understand that they have a business opportunity, and what they're offering the investor is they're lucky to hear about what's going to happen. This is how I'm going to make you money, not can you give me money as a favor, right? And reframing that and owning it and starting to believe your own data around, oh yeah, you know what? You're lucky I'm actually sharing this opportunity with you, because here's how I'm going to make you money. And shifting that dynamic, which is not, it doesn't happen instantly, but starting to reframe it for people that your use of funds isn't, here's all the ways I'm going to spend money. It's here's all the value I'm going to create over the course of time, and how my milestones go up and to the right with your money and make something more powerful, not I'm going to spend on salary, I'm going to spend on this, right? So there's a bunch of skills and tool sets, I think, that we can share either in panels like this, or in accelerator sessions, or at Joy's facility where she's helping boost these new entrepreneurs. I think those are the tools that enable and empower the skills that weren't taught in homes, right? And weren't, even just like the access to how you interact, even teaching around how you do these meetings. It is completely inefficient to try to meet angel by angel by angel. It is broken. It's highly amusing to me that in the innovation space, we have this completely archaic, non-transparent, inefficient model. But okay, so how do you navigate that? How do you have a coffee with a high net worth individual? How do you get in on their radar to be on their level to explain to them the opportunity? Those are not inherent things that most people know. And so I think we have to teach those skills.
Absolutely. Denise, you've been nodding a lot.
We faced a lot of that, oh, just go pound the pavement to get your initial funding. And so the way that we were able to get the traction, so that was one of the reasons we started small. I was like, it's going to be really hard for me to raise money. So for 9 months, we sold cookies out of a car and did demos every single day and did local trade shows to be able to get to the traction level that I thought some angel investors would be interested. Spoiler alert, they still weren't interested, actually, even with that traction. So we started to look at alternative forms of financing, whether that be equity crowdfunding. So we did a Kickstarter campaign that raised $30,000, whether that be pitch competitions. That was really uncomfortable for me, even coming from corporate America. But we were able to raise over $100,000 from pitch competitions. So looking at grants. We worked with lots of local impact organizations, and we're able to raise $50,000 from grants. And so while that didn't get our business to where it was today, it got us to the point that we had enough traction that I could confidently go to these angel groups and say, this is what we've done thus far with a very limited amount of resources. And then we did pound the pavement and meet those angel groups, but we had enough traction to be able to be attractive to them. And so I think for me, it was getting a little bit creative on how we could get the capital that we needed to be able to get the traction, to be able to have those conversations with angel investors.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So can
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry,
please.
Go ahead,
No,
Danny.
please. No, please. I love
I was just gonna
this.
ask, so can we ask the terrible question then? Why do we have to keep doing it that way?
Well, I mean, I think that's, go ahead, Denise, sorry.
I'm hoping that like over time, as more women and Black and brown founders have exits and have liquidity events, that we know the journey and that we then go back and invest in these early founders who don't have the traction, and then hopefully get them and coach them and mentor them and get them ready for that VC level of funding. So I'm hoping that over time, that's one of the ways that things will change.
Denise, I think that you're spot on with that. I mean, one of the things that we found with our fund, so we're, focused, the initial thesis of our fund was very specifically around funding women-led companies because, as most of the audience may know, like less than 2 to 3% of venture capital dollars go to women-led companies today. And that's actually gotten worse. Unfortunately, over the last several years, Q2, PitchBook's numbers were like the worst ever because of the pandemic and the, disparate impact on women during COVID. And so what we did not intentionally go raise our fund from women, but when we did the first close on the fund, we noted that 50% of them were women. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what happens. And all of a sudden, those women who had written the checks started introducing their friends who had not ever invested in venture before to this idea and said, if we don't do this, who will? And by the way, we know what a good business opportunity is. We know how capable we are. We know what a great investment we are. And so let's do this. And we realized, oh, this is our target market for who should invest in the fund is women. And by the time we closed, 80% of our investors were women. It's actually the most ever in a venture capital fund as we understand it. And we realized actually that that's the history of TIE. I don't know if you guys know the Indus Entrepreneur Organization. So it was traditionally an Indian American tech organization. Mm-hmm. What happened and how it got started was in the Bay Area when Indian entrepreneurs had new ideas, and I don't know what era this was, but let's just say like 70s or 80s, so decades ago, they weren't getting funded by the VCs that were funding, the traditional white guys coming out of semiconductor companies, et cetera. And the way they got their companies funded was for each other to fund one another. And I think it's unfortunate that that's the way it has to be, but I also think it might be effective, right? So we have this slide in our current fund deck that basically says the future of investing is gender diverse. We want our thesis to eventually go away, that we don't have to have a fund focused on women, but for today we do. And so having, Indian entrepreneurs or wealthy, successful Indians fund their peer entrepreneurs got that flywheel kickstarted. And I think we're doing the same, with gender with our fund. And I want that to go away where it becomes obvious knowledge, to your point, Denise, by the success stories that come out of it. Oh, diversity does actually add value. The data that, existed in these studies wasn't just, anecdotes. There's actually something fundamental there. And so maybe that's where the flywheel gets started.
One other the flywheel that we really took into account during our Series A funding. So over 50% of our investors are people of color. And so we purposely worked with first-time fund manager like Kevin Johnson and Black Capital, Kwame Anku at Black Star Fund, because we figured that if we could be a success story and be a feather in their cap, that hopefully when they go out and raise money again and say investing in diverse companies is smart business, it'll be easier for them. And then they can deploy more money, and that just continues the flywheel that Kerry mentioned.
So this is interesting too, because you talked about, so we're almost entirely women funded, and that audience to work well for us, which is, I think, what you're talking about women reinvesting to communities and causes. I think that it makes a lot of sense. It's proven out in our experience. But one of the things you mentioned is they go to their women friends and they say, hey, let's pull in more money. And so that, just because of the wealth inequity and how it's been distributed historically, is not often a thing you can do quite as often in communities of color, because that wealth isn't there, right? Because of how the wealth is concentrated. And so there's also this issue, and I'm sure it's the same with women as well, that many successful people of color go on and can oftentimes not have that same sense of pulling people up as they go up as well. It also depends on how organized your communities are. So the Black community has become significantly more organized within venture and within angel funding over the past 5-6 years. Latinx community, not so much. And in fact, in most conversations that we have about BIPOC, it's also like, oh yeah, and Latinx. When they talk about how funded companies are, they're typically talking about the amount of funding for Black funded companies, and it's like, oh, and Latinx is in there somewhere too. So it may not have quite the same dynamic, and in my opinion, it's unfortunate because you talk about like, hey, listen, we can't wait around. Like I can't wait 10 to 15 years for our communities to gain the wealth that we need them to, and at the same time, we seem to be consistently shifting responsibility back toward ourselves, which obviously we all need to take to a considerable degree, right? That's what we've always known. It's what we've always done. But it does sound like a little like white men investors will be white men investors, right? Boys will be boys, which is
I was going to say the word. It sounds like going back to segregated investing.
I would love to understand how we change that dynamic, and like, let's dig in there. I mean, I can't stand every time I go to a panel where there are a bunch of male investors saying, the way I meet entrepreneurs is through introductions of people I already know and trust. It's like, do you hear yourself talking? Like, then you will by definition get the same people coming through. That's actually bad for your business, as well as super short-sighted. Like, why are we not creating more fora for them to see, hey, these are things I wouldn't see. By the way you're successful in venture is by having the diverse point of view, by seeing the thing that other people don't see. So if you only invest in the people in your network that know the people in your network, like, and yet we can't seem to get the message through. So like, I would love to figure out how to fix that.
Yeah, and additional call out there too, it's because earlier you mentioned and both Carrie and Joy, we need to be like educating our founders more, and historically this is like a truism by now. People of color founders are historically over mentored and underfunded. And techstars.org, I'm going to make a call out here that they recently launched an effort, rather than make an explicit effort to fund more people of color founders, they started a nonprofit to be able to raise money from retail investors to then give those to nonprofits that are creating entrepreneurial communities for people of color. And that acrobatics is just crazy to me. Like, it's so impressive, everything they did not to directly fund a founder of color. And that's what we see all the time. So there's always just like, oh, they just, these poor bastards, they just don't know what to do. So we just have to educate them more, right? And it creates this really unhealthy dynamic. And it's why, I've been doing this for many years now, came from tech, we know what we're doing, that I'm very resistant to the idea of more panels. I was on a call, 20 investors, like 60 people of color. They're like, what can we do? Everybody there earnestly, what can we do? And they sat around, they were like, man, how do we get, more resources? And they, what they came up with? I'll do more office hours. I'll do more mentorship. And these things are good. And in fact, I've benefited from Carrie's office hours. She's been very kind to me. But at the end of the day, it's how do we get these people more money? Well, you write checks. And so all of that little grandstanding, to get back to Carrie's point, which is, what responsibility do investors have to other investors, more conscious ones, to other investors, to kind of change that cultural conversation, the conversations we don't really have access to?
I mean, it to some extent backs up to the LPs that fund the investors that actually decide, I'm going to write my check to Kerry and Sarah in order to have them write the checks. And we have been trying to put the burden that you go up to where most institutional funding comes from. And it's endowments and foundations and, public pensions and institutional investors. And they unfortunately do not have a mandate to fund, diversity, whether it's gender or ethnic or socioeconomic. And the ones that actually put programs in place, they're structurally broken where, okay, they're going to fund minority founders, but only if they've got a $500 million fund and they can, and they've already done it before. And we get back in that chicken and egg of, okay, well, there's 5 of those. And so that's not going to expand. And so we've looked upwards to be like, how do we get them to care? And they don't. It's a social mission. And when you make it a financial mission for them, then perhaps it will change, which is why I think, we have to start showing the successes up and then like pushing the data up. Like, you missed out on these opportunities. So it is a long haul. And I would love to fix it some other way. If you give me some tasks to do that, like fix it another way, great. But I unfortunately think it has to be we have these role models and success stories, and you're now missing out on the good stuff, because the future of this country is way more diverse, and the spending power from a consumer point of view is there. And if the only products you have are the traditional products that only service that one component of the community, you're going to miss out on the revenue opportunity there. I just wish this would happen faster, because that's a long process.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Kerry made a point a little while ago around how women are asked different questions when they're presenting to VCs. And I was talking to an urban farmer and co-op owner and food business owner a few weeks ago. And she was talking about how sort of there's this culture of aggression and violence when she is approaching, whether it's a foundation or a bank, or trying to get funding in some other way. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that experience of like how people of color are treated very differently. We've been talking about that a lot during this conversation, but we don't frame it in terms of this violence against Black folks that happens. And I want to sort of dig into that, because that's what we have to change. That's the cultural shift that really needs to happen, not just in the funding world, obviously, but in our society. And I'm wondering, Joy, if you can talk about some of what you and I have had these conversations of how people speak to you, or how people look at you and then make assumptions. And I know you've all had these experiences, and I just want to I think sharing them helps break that cycle of them occurring.
Yeah, I think anybody here can speak to the expectation of not being the expectation of not being knowledgeable about the business or financials, or that what you're going to present is somehow not going to have trajectory, or not have traction, or not have value, or be able to bring value, right? Or being just simply uneducated. Or there's a whole host of words, and then they're the usual stereotypical words, right? And then people are often surprised, and then they become pleasantly surprised and shocked, when you can. And that still happens. It used to happen to me in academia, and it happened in corporate, and it even happens here, right? And so for me, that's not new. I think it is for many entrepreneurs, and it could be the word is traumatizing. Some will go back and not go forward. And it's very distressing to see, because you can you really see when they experience that casual racism, or that casual bigotry, or those microaggressions are now in a different and new arena for them, in a different and new space for them, where they thought the defining issue was their idea and money. Those were the two primary vectors. So yeah.
Sure. Denise, do you want to comment as well?
I think that was one of I will say that I didn't consciously notice any microaggressions tied to my racial background or ethnic background as I was raising, but lots directed towards me being a woman, lots of who's going to take care of your kid, and like, oh, that's so cute. Another mompreneur, another CEO, and like all these like cutesy names. And so it made me, particularly in our most recent round of fundraising, get a lot more selective about the people that we were working with. I will say we didn't have that luxury in our earliest fundraising days. Like, it's easy to say, oh, take smart money, work with people that value you. We were so close to running out of money that as long as the money was green, I would have taken it. Thankfully, it ended up an investor that was a fantastic fit for us said yes at the right time before that happened. But I did experience it as a woman. And I think my kind of learning has been just to coach other female founders and other founders of color about my experience, because I think it really weighs on you a lot personally. And I had a lot of feelings of inadequacy and imposter syndrome, and should I be doing this? And maybe they're right. And you know, what am I thinking, even like thinking this big? And just like sharing that very vulnerably with other people who are going through the experience, because I think it's often like it's easy to feel like you're the only person or something's wrong with you. But as more people are more willing to share their experience with that, I think hopefully that will, I don't want to say normalize it, because those like people treating people like that should not be normal. But at least you'll realize that you're not in this alone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Roman, any comments on sort of the aggression that takes place?
Yeah, I would say if there was aggression, you know, it was very much on the microaggression level and frequent and in ways that I didn't understand. When I went to college, I was always taught when you grow up that you just like, you have to be twice as good as the white person. And that's just, and I didn't have a problem with that at the time. I was like, oh yeah, I'll just be really good at everything. I'll learn everything. I'll be really smart. And I think that created the myth of like competence as credibility. And there's like a myth of meritocracy. And so this is also the issue I have with the education solution, that there's often the belief, oh, you just have to be better founders, right? Oh, you just have to know your numbers better. Oh, you just have to be better at product. You just have to be this and that and that. And I'm very proud of all that I was able to learn. Wouldn't change anything I did. But I'm part of the Giving Network and talk to founders all the time. And you can count the amount of people that have raised more than $250,000 from that group on one hand, and not for lack of talent and not for lack of merit. And so for me personally, I was recently on, again, another one of those calls where somebody said like, oh man, like all these Ivy League kids, they just go out and they get all the funding and stuff. And I raised my hand. I was like, hey you guys, I was an Ivy League grad. Like I went to Brown. They don't just open the curtain for anybody. And there was an investor on the call, a Latina investor, who was like, because when you walk in, they don't see an Ivy League grad, they see a Latino. And it took me a long time to see that sometimes that's what was happening. Also, I don't know, I dress like this and have this beard, I don't know. There's the things I can work on, I'm sure. I'll get my Patagonia vest or something. But there were small things over time, even things like I noticed something going on, and I talked to people and I was like, what do you think the issue is? And when I talked to people, they were like, oh, you seem to like have an answer for everything. Like somebody asks you a question and you seem to have really thought it through, and there's like no room for them to contribute. And there was a good learning there, which is that investors want to feel involved. There's an emotional truth there. But what it told me is also like, yeah, because I've thought a lot about it. So there's, and me and Black male founders talk about this too. There's this feeling of like, you can't be too smart because you can't make the other person feel like you're smarter than them. And again, along the way, I picked up the emotional truths of investing, but it really hit home. It's like, I tried my entire life to just be competent and smart and thoughtful and engaging, but you can't be too much of that. So it's a conversation that we have as male founders of color a lot, and I'm sure female founders of color as well.
No, that happens in bank financial circles as well. That's not, when spreadsheets and how finance works better than some bankers that are sitting in a room, they can get distressed. I'll give you a concrete example. I was actually looking at a property in another city with some folks who I had done some debt work with, and I had brought them up to have a look. And we were looking at the building. I had already done math, numbers. Can we run this company from here? Can we do X, Y, and Z? Made the arrangements. And the brokers and the other folks with the property insisted on talking to the white guy I brought up with me. And every time I point out something, they would answer, they would talk to him. And then talk to him. He noticed too, and he would look at me, and I just let it happen for a little bit. And eventually, the guy I was with looked at the broker and said, you do realize nobody writes a check unless she says that a check gets written. He said, you do realize that, right? And then the broker looked at me and I just went, what he said. I just said, you can keep talking to him, but nobody's gonna write a check unless I say write a check, right? And that stuff, that's commonplace. That's just commonplace,
Well, and I mean, I think that's the issue, that we have to make what has been commonplace, abnormal now, and make, the equality, the default. And that has, I think the last 15 months have shown us that is possible, but it needs to happen with a lot more urgency. It needs to happen more quickly, especially, I think so many people have spent the time in quarantine and lockdown. You have all these entrepreneurs who are going to come out of the pandemic with all of these great ideas from the BIPOC community, and they are going to be great solutions to a lot of different problems, either in our food system or elsewhere. And I think there's going to be a more of a need for investing in those folks than ever before. We only have a few minutes left, so I do want to end on something hopeful, and I'm wondering if you could all share a piece of advice for folks who are coming into this space sort of new, and want to figure out how to make the most of their idea in their business. Denise, do you want to go first?
I think it's talking to as many people as possible, being really vulnerable about what you're working on, being diverse in who you talk to. I think the best advice for me came from founders whose companies failed, and it wasn't for a lack of their intelligence or lack of good product. And so really helping me understand what I was going to be in for this journey, because I don't think I ever in my wildest dreams or nightmares would have imagined what the entrepreneurial journey is, what it is. And so just making sure you ground yourself with a community of people who understand the experience, because a lot of people who have opinions who have never done this before. So talk to people who actually know what they're talking about.
That's great. Thank you. Carrie, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of that this may be easier said than done. And so I don't want to be like, oh, it's so easy to do this. But I think if you're looking specifically to talk to investors, is that planning to talk to them early and build a relationship over time, rather than approaching them when you need to raise funding, is really valuable. And one of the reasons I think why is that they can see change over time. Because there isn't some special answer to like, how do I know when I have enough traction that it looks fundable? It's like, if it's the first time I see it, I don't know yet, And so it's believing in and understanding that entrepreneur's journey over time. Frankly, understanding the struggles and how they overcame them is often more powerful to me than like, everything went up and to the right and it was great. But if I see, hey, when I first talked to you, you were here and now you're here, that's so much easier to start seeing progress than just being like, I just see here. And, hearing if you like took my advice or made the connections that I made, or actually didn't take my advice and why I was wrong, is really powerful. But that kind of stuff, and like actually knowing each other over time, is great. And so you might not get that meeting early. And so one of the things we do is actually put the events we're speaking at up on our website and on Twitter specifically, so that you, in the real world, when we're back to it, you can like be at the stage to meet me afterwards, because I'm going to stay around and take cards and talk to people. So like, you've met me and now you can email me and say, hey, I met you before, etc. And so it does require some hustle. But I do think that the more I've seen you over time, we're actually literally more prone to invest in companies where we've known them for a while. And part of it is just the comfort and the relationship and all those things. So it isn't easy to do. So I recognize when I say that I'm not like,
Sure.
But I think it is valuable.
No, it takes a lot of work, but it does sound very valuable. Roman, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, because it ends up like, if we know like, hey, it's not at least 100% a meritocracy game, it's a relationship game, making those friends early and making many friends. I mean, any success that we've had has been attributed to mine and the team's ability to go out there, learn from the smartest people. We've been able to talk to like founders of Casper, Instagram Magic Spin, like really learn from those folks in a way that's actually allowed us to really ignore a lot of the advice that we had been getting from like B2B SaaS, people who made it in Austin. It's okay to not listen to people. And in fact, you shouldn't listen to most people, but just find out who you need to learn from and learn from those folks. So I think, that's a bit of advice. I will say also, because we almost got to it, as a potential solution, we asked about solutions to these big problems. I actually think that a lot of these things can be solved at the angel level, because that's a person-to-person level. I don't think we're going to change LPs' minds, but I think that activating more angels, having conversations about norms nationally in investing, and having those are the emotional investments. So I think the angel class is really where we can have a huge effect on the amount of founders getting that initial funding. So if people are looking for takeaways, the other takeaway is, if you're out there and listening now and you have the capacity to write checks, Remember that when you're investing, you're not just investing for who you think will win, but for who you want to win. And if you care about these kinds of values, then the best thing you can do is find somebody you resonate with, write a check for women, people of color, LGBT.
Thanks so much. Joy, last word.
Roman said what I was going to say. It was to ask angels to know these folks and to place their bets on those who want to win, they want to see win and align with those values. And the flip side of that is for your entrepreneurs to know your spreadsheets and know your value, so you can tell them exactly what you're going to do and know your value without any shame. This is what's going to happen.
That's a great point to end on. Know your value. Kerry, Denise, Joy, Roman, what a pleasure. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I'm so glad so many folks are going to learn from you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you guys. You guys are awesome.